All right. Podcast Success Community. This is our second Facebook Live. Today we are here with Paul. Paul is the CEO of ListenApp. He is a musician, an artist, a vocal coach, and knows a lot about creating communities around podcasts. So welcome, Mike. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a joy to be here.
All right. Can somebody tell us if the audio is all right? If you hear Paul and if you hear myself?
Testing. 1, 2, 3.
Testing. I think we are good to go. All right, let's start. Yes, thanks, Anthony. Why is it important to create communities around podcasts? Where did you start? And let's start with that maybe.
Yeah, well, there's so many things to talk about when we think about communities around podcasting. Like, podcasting is a very unique form of communication. It's born out of broadcasting, essentially, right? We had radio, where you would just broadcast content through AM/FM players that were mostly in cars and in people's homes, and in that context, it was incredibly challenging to get any kind of access to the listeners, to have feedback from them. So what they would do, if you remember, they would do like call-ins. So you'd be driving to work and they'd be asking you to call in, and that was their form of communicating with people. And they, I don't think radio successfully has ever built communities, or very rarely has it. I mean, and there have been attempts, and a lot of that has to do with, just the nature of the medium. It's a very one-way kind of a medium. And so that's, understandable. Today, when we talk about podcasting, the one of the biggest differences between broadcasting and podcasting is that podcasting is consumed via your mobile phone instead of like the car radio. So you have some advantages there where the people have a device where they can connect with you in some kind of an environment where you could start building community. Yeah. But the challenge is there's an interface issue where, when somebody's listening to audio, their phone is normally off, and there's always going to be built-in friction to engage them in some kind of a social dynamic. So as a result, what I have found is that most podcasters don't really do much of anything in terms of community, simply because it just ends up being very hard. And then when you do bring people into some kind of an environment like a Facebook group or something, the amount of work, first of all, required to get them in there is high. But in the end, you can't interface with your actual content. For example, if you posted a new episode, or I don't know, you had an interview and you had like a talking point that you wanted to discuss with the people, you can't necessarily like be posting a clip of that content into a Facebook group. Maybe you can if you're really clever, and there are ways, but most podcasters haven't figured all that out. And then everybody's listening on a different player, and this is actually where I think podcast is very important, where you provide a way to link to all the different players. Yeah. But still, like, by and large, most podcasters don't know about these tools. They're not aware, and so it's hard to interface with the actual content that you're creating.
Do you see a difference kind of like in these times, like coronavirus, listener numbers go down? Do you see a shift a bit that podcasters are trying to create communities?
I mean, they're talking a lot about it. You're still dealing with the same issues, though, except now it's like people are interested in community, but they're not listening to podcasts, or they're listening less. So it's like while you have a positive, where they want to do community, but now it's like they're not actually making enough time to be engaging with podcasts like they normally did. The biggest thing that went out is the commute time. That's where it's something like 30% of podcast listeners spent their time. So But I am seeing lots of conversation about it, and I wish I would see more success stories of like, hey, here's what I've done so far during COVID-19, and here's what's been working.
Yeah.
I'm in several groups that I'm like looking to hear those kind of narratives and not seeing them just yet, to be honest.
Okay. Do you think you have a stronger kind of audience that also sticks with you during times of crisis, if you have the community?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's really what I think is one of the unique properties of building a community is you build a moat around your listeners where because they are in a community, your podcast becomes much more than another episode to consume. It's not just entertainment, it's not just education, but it's connection. And when you have that element, they come back for that, and that's something that people deeply long for, much more than they long for, a piece of news or update or, education or something of that nature. There's a few things that are very unique about podcasting as opposed to all other forms of media. Like when, we had blogging before podcasting, and when you would read a blog, you could just kind of skim the content. Even now, like you'll Google stuff, right? You end up on a website, you read it. You're not really thinking about who the author is very much, unless you're like maybe like very intrigued by the content. You'll like go down and see who the author is, and you're like, okay, cool. But when you listen to a podcast, because you're hearing the content delivered through the medium of the human voice, who the person is becomes a lot more interesting. And so, as a result, you get some interesting things. You get listener loyalty goes up like crazy, where on average, when people subscribe to a podcast, they listen to 88% of the content, which is insane. Like nobody follows a blog and reads 88% of everything. That's very unique. And then you get very strong parasocial dynamics where the podcaster becomes kind of a celebrity in the mind of the listener because you're receiving a lot of content in a very personal way. So the listeners actually want access to the podcaster.
Yeah. So the celebrity part can, of course, also happen without a community, but the community makes it and enhances that effect.
Yeah, well, I guess where I'm going with this is that podcasting is actually a very unique place for naturally forming communities. I would say it's even some of the best naturally forming communities that are completely untapped because like all of the right dynamics are in place except for access. So you have like this loyalty aspect, you have, this like personality leader aspect, you have this like motivational aspect of the listeners wanting to engage with the personality. Then you have another critical, block happening here where the listeners are subscribing to content that they actually care about, because listening takes time, and you're not just going to be subscribing to something that doesn't interest you at all. So you're also curating around a very specific topic that's deeply interesting, and so the only thing that's missing really is access to each other and some kind of prompts into conversation. So podcasting is the perfect environment to be creating communities, and it's very important that podcasters lean into this, because especially independent creators, like it's one thing, like say you're a giant network, like I don't know, Wondery or NPR or something, right? And you have producers that are working full time that are reporting on stories, and they have you have musicians on staff, and you're creating content that's just like kick ass. Like like when people are at home, they will normally prefer Netflix over podcasting. The reason is because it's just more entertaining. You have video, it captures attention better than just audio on average. So in a similar way, like when you have NPR and Gimlet and whatever Wondery producing these shows, they're able to captivate people's attention in a very good way because they have just such awesome talent performing there. So how is it that independent creators can compete in an environment where you have those kind of shows, and everyone has only a limited number of hours or time to listen to content per day. So how do you compete in that environment? And community is probably one of your biggest competitive advantages, because that's something that those other companies or those other podcasts will struggle to do. And the reason for that is because it's hard for them to go niche. What they can do is create good broad category, content. But what you can do as an independent creators, you can select a very specific group of people and say, I'm going to identify with these people and speak to them how they want to be heard and address the issues that are, so specific to their lives that no podcast could ever do that, if they're trying to reach, some global audience. And
so
really,
you're saying big media cannot go niche because they need the audience to get their returns back, I guess.
Exactly.
And that's where you, as an independent podcaster, can be without getting overrun by bigger shows.
That's your competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Yep. Is to go niche, and you have to, like, when podcasters oftentimes are creating a show and they're asking me for advice, like how should I go about it? My number one advice always is don't start with a topic, start with a people. So think of a specific group of people in your life, somebody ideally, like, these are the people. Here's approximately maybe even where they live, how much money they make, like what they're interested in, like here's why they want to hear it, and like understand them thoroughly, and then start with that group of people and start creating content for them. If you start with a topic, then you don't really know who the people are. It's much harder to go backwards like that. And then go ahead if you were going to say something.
No, really interesting approach to that.
Yeah, well, and then if you do that, then the community aspect makes a lot of sense, because you've been thinking about the community from the beginning. Yeah. And then you engage them because you know who they are.
So you're saying you don't care much about the topic in the beginning, you care about who your listeners are, or
yes.
you care about who you want to serve with your podcast.
Yeah.
And then from there start creating your shows.
Yes. You have to, I mean, that's the smartest way, but it's not easy, because a lot of times, podcasters say, well, I'm, looking to address creators or something like super broad and generic, like so is Apple, and it's too broad. It's too broad. Like, you have to be able to, like, say you live, I don't know, like in New York, and you're going to be, okay, I'm going to talk to moms in Brooklyn who are single and are ethnic or something, and like, so you're addressing a very specific group of people, and you're going to, and then you ask the next question is, what is it that's on their mind the most? What do they care about the most? What's worrying them? What are they interested in? What are they talking about? What are the struggles? And when you understand the environment, the challenges, and ideally you're maybe another mom in Brooklyn who's having this situation, and you learn something along the way, so you're going to now invite these other listeners into a community where you're going to be creating content for them that's going to speak to them in a way that Gimlet, even though they're also in Brooklyn, could never do.
What do you say to people who say, I want to serve everyone, I want to share my gift with everyone?
I mean, if I want to be an ass, I'll say you're probably going to fail.
Okay.
If I want to be nice, I will try to reason them out of it. Because, I mean, in all honesty, whenever somebody starts with that, it almost never works. Unless you are just some world-class talent and you have some edge and you're going to become the next Joe Rogan. But everybody wants to be Joe Rogan, and there's only one Joe Rogan. It's like there's limited attention that people have of how much time they can spend listening to content. And you have to think of, like, why should somebody listen to you instead of these other amazing people who are incredibly smart, and their guests are way better than your guests, and they're way more interesting and they're way more experienced. Why should they listen to you? Yeah. Like, that's, like, you have to be so brutally honest, and the number one advantage is if you go niche.
Yeah.
And the fear that people have is like, well, if I go niche, then I'm limiting my audience to a tiny group of people. Then, I'm not gonna go big, yada yada yada. And that's also a completely wrong way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
If you can get 1,000 people who just freaking love your content and listen to every episode, you can grow that. Like, believe me, if you can resonate with the moms in Brooklyn, you'll resonate with the moms in, I don't know, in Chicago and in LA and, etc. So like, the listenership will be far broader, but you have to really understand the people. And if you understand them, then the transition into the community actually becomes very normal, because part of understanding them is engaging with them. You have to, like, eventually you start running out of content. Eventually you start repeating yourself.
Yeah.
And because you just kind of exhaust your own storage of knowledge, especially if you're creating content several times a week. Like, there's only so much that you'll say, and then you're just kind of becoming repetitive, and then your listeners start dropping off because, like, okay, I think I've heard everything this person has to say.
Yeah. So if you go to what is a niche, are moms a niche? Are single moms a niche? Are single moms living in Brooklyn, is that a niche? Are women entrepreneurs a niche? Or should you dive deeper?
The deeper you dive, the more you'll resonate. The more you resonate, the more engaging you'll be. Because, like, think about this. Imagine that you are that mom. And if you hear that somebody is creating content for single moms in Brooklyn, and you are a single, like, you're like, oh my God, these are my people.
Yeah.
Versus if you hear content for moms, you're like, oh, well, it could be, a privileged mom in, suburban neighborhoods in some wealthy, place. Well, like, that's not me at all. So, like, if you just hear moms, you're like, maybe, but it's not you enough.
And I think the interesting thing is as well that if you do that, other ones that are not exactly this person will also resonate with it, right?
I mean, it's interesting because, yes, some will start listening just out of curiosity, even if that's not them necessarily. Yeah. Others will still find very interesting lessons for sure. But those who are in that niche, the thing is there are a lot of single moms out there.
Yeah.
And if you could start with a very specific group of people, maybe in your own locale, because you'll understand that demographic better than any other city in any other environment. And if you can speak to them, then you'll be able to speak to, single moms all over the place. And then as you hear back from them, like, if you think about a global audience of English speaking single moms, for example, that's large. That's really large. So it's actually not very niche. Even though it seems like it's niche, it's actually a ginormous audience. So you just, but you have to think about it that way, and you have to start like it's like building any startup. You have to think, okay, how do I get my first 100 users or listeners?
Yeah.
And I'm saying not just like somebody who subscribed to your show and your content was downloaded to the phone and then they didn't listen to it. I'm talking about like they listen to every episode and they love what you're doing.
Okay.
How do you get 100? That's it. Like, and then you build to 1,000 and then to 10,000.
Okay. So, the topic is still communities, and I think it's important that niching down is the fundament of being able to create a community. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Because if you're too broad, then it will be very, very hard to build one. Right.
Yes, absolutely. Because it's the same question. Like, if you're a listener, like, and somebody's inviting you into a community, you're thinking, who are these people? Yeah. Why should I be in that community? Like, who are the people? So, right. That's communities comprised of a kind of people. People determine the culture.
So even if you have kind of a show which is not completely niched down, and it reaches a broader audience and it works okay-ish, quite well, and you want to create a community, is it smart to think about, okay, what subsections of my genre or my topic can I pick out and create basically a niche community in a bit broader picture?
Yeah, that's the smartest way. So if you have a broad podcast, don't do a broad community. Like select a niche group. So you're gonna say, okay, like, hey guys, we're gonna start a community for those of you who are this or doing this or looking for this, and it should be something that you are most fluent in or you're most versed in. So you're an expert in that field. And they would want to rally around you for for that community. Now, another thing here that's critically important is the only way to continue creating content that's engaging in a niche community is you have to be engaged with the listeners. You need ways to engage with them. Otherwise, you lose touch.
Yeah.
Eventually, you go into abstractions where you start speaking in theoretical language. That and the more theoretical it becomes and the more abstractions you introduce, the less you relate to the people and the less engaging you become. And so the only way to stay on the ground is being engaged in their lives. And this is what's really challenging about podcasting in doing niche content is how the F do you engage with them, because it's a one-way like FM radio medium, where like all the podcast players have been commoditized strictly. They're like your FM car player. That's all they do. They just play the content.
Yeah.
And if you want to like hear back from them, what do? Like call me. And then so like podcasters will do, they'll say, well, you can email me. Here's my email. Like, have you tried that? If you tried that, you've probably like gotten one email back. Yeah. Think about it for the listeners. Like you're washing your dishes, and the podcaster is saying, like, "Here's my email." Like
maybe the reviews are a bit touching on that.
The reviews a little bit, but it's not nearly the kind of engagement that you need, and so it's just hard. Like if we're really honest, like anytime we want to solicit engagement, there's this friction that has to be overcome. Okay. Like even if you're like doing, I'm gonna do a live call, would love for you guys to join me, and then how do you you don't have their emails, you don't have their phone numbers, you have no way of reaching them.
Okay, so what's the next step? Let's say I have a podcast, it's a bit broader topic, I find my niche in which I want to create a community. What's the next step?
The next step is you have to pick a platform. Like what's that place going to be? Where are you going to meet? And obviously it's going to be a digital platform because you're talking about, doing this at scale. Yeah. So like there's only a handful of platforms available. Obviously the biggest ones would be the more or less traditional social networks. And I distinguish social media from social networks. Like TikTok is social media where the connecting with people is not as important. Whereas like Facebook, the connection is actually, important. So like, okay, so say we do Facebook, which is probably in terms of like traditional social media, that's probably one of the better platforms, like doing a Facebook group, even though I'm not a supporter of Facebook and I don't necessarily like everything about it, but it's just they've built a lot of good tools, right? And everybody's on it, so there's a convenience aspect. So still like, okay, so imagine you do Facebook groups. You have to think about, okay, is it the best place? Mm-hmm. And what are going to be the challenges? What are going to be the drawbacks? So like, first of all, anywhere you go is going to be third-party platform, and you're going to have to somehow get your listeners to take action as they're listening to your podcast, to then go on their phone, find your group or whatever, request to join. Like, why should they do that? And why is it important to you? And then what will the interactions look like? So I think Facebook is good. I have seen, good examples of podcasters have Facebook, but not nearly like what you would think. And part of the reason is, like I said early on, is it's so much work, to get your listeners into the Facebook group. And in the end, you're still like the content you're creating is not a blog, it's audio. And your Facebook content becomes completely detached from the content you're actually creating for them. So I guess I'll give a little plug for Listen App. This is particularly where our product comes in. Yeah. Like this is the thing that we're trying to solve is how do you interface or how do you create a podcast community that interfaces with audio? And that's what we've been pioneering and developing. So listenapp.co. is our company we launched recently. And what we've done is created an environment where your listeners can listen to your podcast and then interact with it using their voice. So they'll go in and add a comment and they'll speak into their phone, not like on a desktop or something, because most of them are listening on their phone. And so they'll speak right into their phone as they're walking or whatever they're doing. They can do that, through their AirPods, and then you can also even use their audio comments in your podcast. So you can say, hey, last week on the episode we had this discussion. You play the question or the conversation that took place in the comments, and then you comment on it. So there's a continual feedback loop of what's happening.
So basically what you're saying is choose a platform where the friction is as low as possible to get them from your audio to the actual platform. I think.
Yeah. So think very critically about like when you're choosing a platform, like what's going to be the best place to be forming this community. Yeah. So like if you're choosing Facebook, think of the positive, think of the negative. Yeah. If you're choosing like, our Listen app, think of positive, negatives, or whatever else you might choose. Some are doing even like Twitch. Some will go to invite their listeners on Twitter. It just depends where your listeners are hanging out as well.
Yeah. David says they build a community around the podcast. It's quite a strong community on social, especially Twitter, but that hasn't translated into podcast downloads. How do we bridge that?
And this is I'm so glad you mentioned this. I've also been talking to a lot of podcasters and I've heard the same thing. Like they will start creating communities on Instagram or Twitter, and they'll find that it's actually a different community than the actual listeners. And like they'll be creating content, on Twitter that's text based, and so they'll attract people on Twitter, but they're not necessarily the same people who are listening to their content, and it doesn't necessarily translate to a community that's growing and becoming, active and inviting people and viral in any kind of, capacity. And part of that challenge is it's a fundamental interfacing issue where the best content that you're creating, that you're investing all your time in, doesn't interface with Twitter. So you have to recreate your content, in tweets, which is a different format. And that's not, you're not a blogger, you're a podcaster, and so it's hard. Then you have to think of like if you're going to want to create content for Twitter that's going to go viral, it needs to be very like witty, pithy statements that are going to be super shareable and that are going to identify and resonate with people. And you have to know how to like who to tag and build like a community in the Twitter environment that's native to how people interact on Twitter, and that's a whole other strategy and skill set.
Okay.
But if it's just but if you're really good at podcasting, it's a different game.
I get what you mean. Yeah. So if you niche down, if you chose the platform, what's next? I mean, you chose the platform, you need people there, and then you need to engage with them, right?
Yes. So then the next question is, well, how do you bring them over to the platform? And the thing is like you want the actual listeners there because that's the content you're creating. That's what you're best at, right? That's getting people excited. So how do you, get them over there? So I'll talk about it from the perspective, if you're using our Listen app, then you're bringing them into a place where they're actually listening to your content. So that community is actually the group of people who's listening to your content. Yeah. And then you could rally them around that. So then it's it's a strategy game. How do you have to exercise empathy here, like visualize yourself as being a listener, not a podcast creator, and you're hearing call to action on a podcast. Hey, join our community. Like, would you join? Like, what's the incentive? Is it strictly just this like broad join, or what is being offered? And so here, there's a few things that are very important. First of all, there needs to be some kind of a mission that aligns deeply with your core beliefs and values. So like, hey guys, I believe this. I believe that moms in Brooklyn can have a better future if they do this or something, you know. So that there's some fundamental belief that's driven by something deeper and more meaningful, and then you say like, and I'm looking to, you know, and I'm inviting you to join our community. Here's what we're doing. You know, I want to hear your stories. I want to interact with you.
Can you give us an example, kind of a real world example?
You know what? I wish I had more. I can follow up with an email actually and send you a little list. I have saved. But honestly, for me, I have to like look for good podcast communities and find them. It's not as easy doing them on like Facebook and such.
So also the decision of actually doing a community should be very consciously. You shouldn't just start a community out of the sake of starting a community. Is that true?
Yeah. Well, then it becomes just like this thing that you feel like you need to do.
Yeah.
Without it being incredibly intentional. Like if you decide to do it, it needs to be thought through. It needs to be very intentional, and then you execute hard. Then it becomes not just like a by the way thing if you really want to, but you know like then it becomes like, hey, this show is part of a community. Like this podcast that I'm creating is all about you. Here's what we're doing. Here's, you know, where we're at. And then you would say something like, hey, we're on the Listen app. Here's what we're on Facebook, and here's what people are saying. And then you feature their voices in your podcast. The questions they're asking, you integrate into your podcast so that it becomes a regular two-way flow.
So also the question of David, like that they have a strong community on social, but it doesn't reflect into download numbers. For me, it wasn't really connected. It's more, if you have a community, then you have a stronger base. It doesn't really mean that your download numbers increase automatically, but the quality of your audience is way better than not having a community. I see what you're saying. Difference between growth and retention, right? And that community retention more than growth necessarily. I think a strong community should do both. Okay.
Where if somebody is really, really a part of the community and they're enjoying it, they will typically be talking about it and recommending it to others, and there will be some kind of a natural organic growth to it. There should be, if people really are deriving value from something. Then it becomes a question of how do you activate your community members to facilitate growth. You just have to think through the mechanisms. Sometimes they're more than willing to, be agents of growth for you. You just have to prod them and create an environment where they do that. Maybe it's some kind of ambassador program where you have to empower them. And the last thing perhaps that I'll say about communities is the one mistake that I see people making is they'll start to create communities and it becomes about them as the podcaster, where it's like another place for them to do talking, teach, and to be an expert,
Yeah.
And as do that, it's like, why? I already have you in my podcast feed. Like,
okay.
I need to.
Well, it's a good point, right?
Yeah, it needs to be about the people. Once you create the community, like this is where they talk. And as much as possible, you want to just be a conversation starter. And even better is if you if the community itself needs to facilitate the conversation starting point. So the way to do that initially, that works very well, is once you start the community, identify the biggest fans, and just recruit them to be active and empower them. Say, hey, I'm going to ask you for your help. We're starting this community. Mm-hmm. I would love if you would maybe, once a week start a conversation topic. It would be so helpful to me. They'll be so glad to do that. Okay. But if you do that with a handful of people, where you just personally one-on-one invite them to be starting conversations, and then it feels very organic that the community is leading this. But if it's always you as the host that's forcing it, then it feels like, well, I don't know, it's not the same.
Yeah. Okay. Would you drive people to your community or only from your podcast to the community? Like directly or always via your show? I think that's the question of Anthony. Like, where do you start building your community? I'm using cold outreach to my ideal listeners to drive them to my show or website.
I see. If there's cold outreach, yeah, that's cold outreach is difficult. You have to really, again, try to understand who you're reaching out, and why they should listen, and sometimes, so you have to think of the funnel. Sometimes it works to send them straight, to the show. The challenging part is it's almost impossible to track, like, did they start listening? Are they listening? Because there's no real, feedback metrics on that. If you send them to your website, then you have to install pixel trackers or something to know if they clicked, but still you don't know if they've become part of your community. Yeah. I don't know if, cold outreach is the best strategy for growing a podcast. Maybe it can be done. I'm not saying it's not a good one.
I guess if your podcast is around the business and then you use cold outreach for your business, and then they kind of naturally convert into listeners of your show if they're really interested in your product, right? So that could work, but yeah.
The best strategies in podcasting, because the thing is, you have to be able to reach other podcast listeners, and that's the hardest part. Not everybody is a everyday podcast listener, and so whenever you do outreach, whether it be ads or cold outreach or whatnot, 80% of all of your efforts are going to people who don't really listen to podcasts. And so even if they are in your demographic, but are they podcast listeners, which is another sub-niche of the demographic. And so what ends up happening, the best way is to try to partner with other podcasters who have parallel audiences.
Yeah.
And then, find ways to work with them to advertise your show, to grow an audience. Is through other shows and other platforms that have
you would I think that's the point, try to grow your show, and then from your show drive them into your community. Is that true?
Yeah,
that's the usual.
Usually, yeah, that would be the final process, because it's hard to take them straight to the community without them knowing what you're about.
Yeah, and them trusting you, right? That you're the right person for
yeah, there's trust. I usually just never join a community just because, why? I need to know what's happening there. What's the value? Who am I joining? Who are these people?
Yeah.
And that's where it's much easier to start listening to content than to want to join a community. So for sure, I think it's good to drive them. I would be partnering with people, once you've identified your niche, then think of who are the people who are speaking to that, people that have influence over them, who they respect, and have those people on your show, and then use those people. Maybe those people don't have their own podcast, but because they're your guest or something, they'll have access to those people to get you the exposure.
Okay, let's say you started your community. You need to identify your biggest fans in that community, or your biggest kind of fans in terms of listeners, and then try to work with them in engaging the community and in driving the conversation.
Yep. Once you identify them, I would do one-on-one outreach to your biggest fans and tell them what you're doing with the community, and ask them to help you with something very specific. Most of them will be very glad to be a part of that, and say, hey, I want to have conversations on these topics. Once a week, can you post a question on this or something, where they feel like, they're responsible for something. Because again, you want to make it about them. You want to empower them, give them the right environment, and then once you create that space, then you'll just see it take off, and it'll be its own beautiful thing, where the conversation cues will be the content you create, and then your biggest fans and ambassadors will be the ones to facilitate those conversations.
I think that was a great closing sentence.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Do you guys have any questions? We have a few listeners here, not many, but maybe in the replays. Paul, can you tell us a bit more about Listen App and how it can help our users to create niche communities without much effort, with a little fraction of building communities on other platforms, and they listen on a podcast player? I think that's basically why you created Listen App, right?
Yes. The thing that, if you're thinking about platforms where to build your community, what Listen App will be doing differently than anything else is it'll be completely integrated into your flow of content. And I think that's a tremendous advantage. Whereas, if you do, well, first of all, I'll say this: anywhere you go, you're going to be using third-party platforms. So you're going to be inviting them somewhere outside of where they're listening, right? And so there's going to be friction anywhere you go. With like a Facebook group, they're listening here, and then you're inviting them to discuss here.
Yeah.
And so you're having to engage with them in two different environments.
Yeah.
And just that alone, like they're going to one app to listen, another app to talk, and they're always switching. And that friction is actually what makes it difficult. So what we've done is just one place to listen and talk.
Yeah.
So you just go through the friction once. Once you get them to join you on the Listen app in that environment, then anytime they're listening, they're also talking. So you're not having to cross that platform, friction every time you're facilitating conversation.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great platform. You just launched 1 week or 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, we launched like a week and a half ago, but we just released the framework. Next week we'll start officially onboarding podcasters, where you can go in and claim your show. But you can already start bringing your listeners over there. We have, several pretty large podcasters that are already,
cool.
Advertising it in their content.
Cool. If our users want to contact you and reach out to you, how can they find you?
Easiest way would be just through our website, listenapp.co. I have content up there. I'm sorry, contact information up there, and then up top it says I'm a podcaster. If you go and subscribe, you'll be on our podcaster updates, so that you'll know when we're opening all the early access features.
Cool. We'll post the link in the comments, so you can click on it. Great. Thank you so much for joining us. We're already here for 40 minutes. And my screen shut down.
Oh.
Back. All right. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope this was useful for you guys. Enjoy the rest of your day and talk soon.
All right. See ya.
Bye.
It's nice to connect.